Hello! So today we're going to talk about some ethics, but not just normal ethics, what's right and wrong. No, we're going to talk about meta-ethics. What are these things we call ethical properties and values? Are they real and observable? Just figments of our imagination? We'll see. Today's topic in meta-ethics is going to focus on what kind of property moral properties are. So there are two main camps, naturalists and non-naturalists. Naturalists think that moral properties are, well, natural properties. You know, they're like the color green, how big something is, or the property of being a square. Non-naturalists are essentially the opposite. They think that moral properties aren't natural. They are some other thing that exists, but are much more difficult to analyze and describe. But you may be wondering, why is this even important? Who cares about what kind of property moral properties are? It doesn't really make a difference to us. I mean, morals are just morals. So here's the kicker. If moral properties are natural, that means we can find them. And implicitly, that means we can find what is right and good. This action that someone proposes, we can figure out if it is indeed morally good. And you can't disagree. That would make the argument similar to arguing if this mug is white, for example. Just look at it. But if moral properties aren't natural, then we can't really describe them with natural properties. In a way, the most we can say is what we should do, or what we think we should do, but never really, this is for sure the objectively right thing to do. So what does that say for moral disagreement? We don't know what the right answer is. So now hopefully you're interested in finding out whether moral properties are natural or not. In this video, I will be explaining this subject from a primarily non-naturalist view. Let's dive in. G.E. Moore, perhaps one of the most famous non-naturalist philosophers, poses an interesting argument to naturalists, called the open question argument. In short, his argument is that, hey, I can ask you if natural property A is the same thing as moral property B, and this is an interesting question. However, because this is an interesting question, that must mean the properties aren't the same. In other words, if I ask you, is maximizing utility, which is a natural property, right? It's a question worthy of some thought. On the other hand, if I ask you, is the color red red, you'd probably think that I was crazy. Like, what do you mean, is the color red red? Yeah, it is. Another popular example is the question, is a bachelor an unmarried man? Well, yes, that is just what a bachelor is. Maybe you're asking because you don't know what the word bachelor means. But in terms of properties, if you knew what they were, you couldn't intelligibly ask that question. But let's ask the question, do dogs have tails? Well, it seems like this question is also redundant, but what if there are some dogs that don't have tails? The answer could be no, so it's worth asking. Versus the bachelor question, can a bachelor be a married man? Well, no, bachelors are defined to be exactly an unmarried man. This question is meaningless if the properties are the same. But that's precisely his argument. The question is only interesting if you ask about two different properties. And so because the question is maximizing utility right is interesting, maximizing utility and right could not be the same properties. It could be true that maximizing utility is part of being right, but they cannot be exactly the same. So no moral property is identical to any natural property, which means moral properties aren't natural. You can't describe them with natural properties. One way to see this is that if you take a moral property and try to trim it down by describing it with natural properties, at some point you will have a property that you just cannot describe with natural properties, since moral properties can never be identical to a natural property. As Moore says, moral properties like goodness are just indefinable. But if you were a naturalist, maybe you're not satisfied. One common counterargument is, what about the question, is water H2O? Obviously both are the same thing, but the question is intelligible and interesting. How's that? Well, the naturalist, actually specifically a non-analytic naturalist, which we won't get into the difference now, but just take my word for it. But anyway, the naturalist would argue that there are different concepts. Same property, two different concepts. Water talks about the liquid in rain and lakes and such, and H2O talks about the molecular structure and chemistry side. Same thing / property, but two different concepts. So hey, that refutes Moore's question. Turns out you can ask intelligible questions about the same property, they just have to have different concepts. So what, his argument doesn't work? Well, here's where a dude named Derek Parfitt comes in. He kind of builds upon Moore's open question idea and comes up with a challenge to non-analytic naturalists. His claim is a statement about two identical properties must have some sort of substantive information. As in, let's assume, for the sake of argument, maximizing utility is the same property as being right. Well, the statement, an action that maximizes utility is right, must give the listener some information. For the water case, learning that water is H2O gives us information about the chemical composition and the idea that the stuff that falls from the sky is the same as this molecule that we create in a lab with hydrogen and oxygen. So, this is a tough challenge for the non-analytic naturalist. If they think some moral property is the same as a natural property, then they better be able to explain the additional information from stating that they're the same. There are a few strategies that naturalists have proposed, so let's explore them. Sidebar. From this point on, we'll be using the properties maximizing utility and right for sake of example. You could really use any moral property and have the same argument, but it's just easier to explain with these. So our assumption is an action that maximizes utility is right. Sidebar. The first strategy, called metalinguistic, goes into the idea that when you learn an action that maximizes utility is right, you learn that you can correctly describe an action that maximizes utility as right. Seems promising. But the problem is that this is a linguistic issue, as in we can technically call anything, anything. It's just language. We could reasonably call a morally wrong action right, without caring about whether the action was actually right or not. Linguistics aren't tied to the properties, so we don't really get any substantive information. Strike one. Strategy two. Let's call this the negative. So this strategy goes into the idea that when you learn that an action that maximizes utility is right, you learn that it is right and only right. Nothing else, there's no other thing attached. This implies that you learn that there are no other normative properties attached, meaning there's no property that tells you that you should act or do this action. So this one's a little confusing, but on the basic level, the naturalist would be arguing that all you learn is that maximizing utility doesn't have some normative property besides what is included with being right. But that seems odd. That would mean the only information from the statement, an action that maximizes utility is right, is negative? It tells you what isn't, but not what is. That doesn't sound right, and it shouldn't. This claim is obviously supposed to convey some sort of positive substantive information. And the argument that all the information it gives is negative just isn't a compelling argument. That's like saying water is H2O is only telling you that water is not salt. Not satisfactory. Strike two. The third argument, and perhaps the most compelling, is the normative argument. This naturalist would claim that when you learn an action that maximizes utility is right, you learn that actions that maximize utility have some other moral property. In other words, because maximizing utility is right, that would mean that it has some other moral property, let's call it P. So this is certainly positive substantive information. So you may be convinced the challenge has been refuted. But there's a catch here. What is that other property P? Well, it either has to be natural or non-natural, because those are the only options. If it's non-natural, well, boom, we have shown non-naturalism. So I'm assuming the naturalist would claim that P is a natural property. But if P is a natural property, we can just ask the same question again. Does the statement, an action that maximizes utility is P, give you substantive information? Well, we're back to square one. The question is never answered, but just always deflected. It essentially goes on an infinite loop, asking if the statement gives substantive information and answering yes with the same question. Since there is no clear resolution at any point, this argument doesn't seem to work either. Strike three. So it looks like Parfitt and Moore are correct. Moral properties are non-natural. Well, what now? It seems to imply that moral disagreements can't really be resolved, at least easily. We can't just look at some property of an action and claim that it is right or good because it has that property. Also, we don't know what moral properties are. I mean, we can't describe them. Things are just good because they are good. good, we can't really explain why. That might seem unsatisfactory, but that's precisely why this is interesting. Maybe we need to look at this problem from some other point of view. So if you're interested in trying to find the answer to this question, go explore metaethics.